What does the name Cronenberg mean to you? Does it conjure up images of bodily mutilations and transformations? Does the very name cultivate thoughts of narratives and subtext seemingly pregnant with cultural and societal issues about to be explored? For some, the name Cronenberg encapsulates all of these things and more. With films such as Rabid, The Brood, Scanners and The Fly, David Cronenberg firmly established himself as Canada's most provocative director. Although some may discard films such as these for their genre identity, Cronenberg infuses them with intelligence, emotional heft and psychological resonance that elevates them over the genre they are predispositioned into. Movies such as Dead Ringers, Videodrome and Naked Lunch not only increased his own fan base, but due to their intellectual value transferred him from being simply a provocative horror director known for gore and fantastical effects, but rather as an active auteur and cultural hero, one whose films are rich with intellect and thematic layers. This dissertation will feature such a development, with its primary focus being on Cronenberg's use of the body, particularly in the subgenre of body horror, something that Cronenberg is seemingly obsessed with. This method of examining body horror will frame discussions surrounding his films including Shivers, Rabid, The Brood, Scanners, The Fly, Dead Ringers, Videodrome, Naked Lunch and Existence. This video should help reveal the concerns and obsessions that are numerous throughout Cronenberg's rich body of work, particularly concerns surrounding the body in all its forms and altercations. Although perhaps he might not have been involved in genre cinema and establishing his own cult of cinema, assuredly David Cronenberg was destined for a career in the arts. He was born on the 15th of March 1943 into a Jewish middle-class family in Toronto. His mother was a pianist, father a freelance writer, while his older sister Denise was a ballet dancer who would later be costume designer for his films. As David was exposed to the arts in a variety of ways, this greatly helped to cultivate his own interests, and as such he performed well at school. Cronenberg also developed an interest in the sciences, seeing both art and science as two equal intellectual endeavours, and as such enrolled as a science major at the University of Toronto in 1963. It seems that Cronenberg had an interest in the sciences in the body from such an early age, something that will be seen readily throughout his films. Although, this was not to last, as Cronenberg dropped out after several months, citing a lack of creativity and discovery that caused him to lose interest. Cronenberg then decided to enroll in English, and after 2 years decided to travel to Europe and became heavily involved in underground cinema. Inspired by David Sector's Winter Kept Us Warm, Cronenberg then decided to make his own features, including Transfer and From the Drain, but perhaps more importantly in gaining reputation was Stereo and Crimes of the Future. These two contained a variety of elements that would be featured throughout his career, including scientists and patients, clinics, experiments, body horror, sexuality, telepathy, amongst a variety of other associated hallmarks. As is typical with underground cinema, Stereo and Crimes of the Future were released screen by screen, garnering more attention and reputation each time. After this success and favourable reviews, Cronenberg worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Company and made 3 short fillers. Becoming increasingly disillusioned with his lack of progress surrounding the advancement of his own work, Cronenberg had to convince himself to view his films as movies and not cinema. Cronenberg referring to have his movies become and be a part of the economic industry, equally serving both commercial and artistic needs instead of purely the latter. With this in mind, Cronenberg set his sights on features that contain exploitative natures, which his next 2 features would certainly inhibit. Illustrating himself in the horror genre, these 2 features would be Shivers and Rabid. After his script was turned down by several studios, Cronenberg then turned to John Dunnan and Andre Link of Cinepix. Cinepix was notorious for softcore porn features, but by the early 1970s became much more interested in low-budget horror films. Link and Dunn were both enthusiastic about the script, but were unsure if Cronenberg himself would be a good fit for the feature, and as such started looking elsewhere for a director. This angered Cronenberg, who said that the only way that they can have his script is if they take him on board as a director as well. And as such, the inexperienced Cronenberg had to learn the fundamentals of commercial filmmaking whilst on the job, with help from the cast and crew. Shivers was released in 1975 and follows the story of parasites being released into an apartment complex and who are now attacking and controlling the tenants. Before discussing the various elements contained within Shivers, it is important to examine and understand body horror as a whole. Body horror, as the name implies, often showcases graphic depictions of biological violations of the body. It is usually non-discriminate and will attack others at will. There is often a primordial aspect relating to body horror. In its attack, it is body to body with a little sophistication behind it, breaking down the horror to its most pure biological self. Throughout a variety of ways, Cronenberg is fascinated with the composition of the human body and how it's perceived to look. By placing such arresting visuals in much of his films, Cronenberg challenges these perceptions.
I've gradually come to realize, for me, the body is the first fact of human existence for me. And so my imagery tends to be very body-oriented. My narratives tend to be very body-oriented. And I think I'm interested in transformation as well, but not in a sort of a very abstract spiritual sense, or at least not at first, but in a very physical sense.
In short, body horror is total terror, emanating and coming from within, which Cronenberg was astutely tapped into from the beginning, considering the title for Shivers in several territory was They Came From Within. The opening shots summarise a variety of themes featured throughout Shivers. We see a loving couple checking into an apartment block, which is juxtaposed against a teenager being assaulted and ultimately murdered and mutilated. Such is the same with Cronenberg's thematic concerns throughout the narrative, a contrast between the idyllic and sterile, with the parasitic contagion and infection, perfectly visually realised between the white sanitary hallways and the organic blood-red slithering parasites. What Cronenberg taps into throughout this feature is our fear of the invasion of our privacy and ourselves, the ultimate and final barrier to privacy being our bodies. One scene in particular when this is very apparent is when a tenant is attacked by a parasite whilst bathing. The bath, being a place of cleanliness and hygiene as well as being primarily private, is penetrated and corrupted by the presence of a parasite. Cronenberg invokes terror by removing all safe havens for us, striking when we're at our most susceptible. Although the parasites could be seen as very destructive and violent, especially sexually, they could also be seen as liberators as well, the start of a revolution from the concerns of our bodies and sexual differences and preferences, which is indicated by the intense sexual appetite demonstrated by those infected.
I'm hungry. I'm hungry for love. I'm hungry for love.
It enables those who are infected to carry out their innermost basic primordial desires, particularly those desires surrounding violence and sex, reducing their bodies to mere vessels. If examining this narrative as a revolution of sorts, then this revolution is a success, as every tenant is infected by the end, which sees them travel into the mainland to infect more. Although it received mixed to negative reviews, Cronenberg will continue his themes of bodily infections, as well as examining a similar revolution of the body in its virtually spiritual successor, Rabid. After a motorcycle accident, Rose is checked into the nearby Celluloid clinic for plastic surgery, where a radical new method of skin grafts is used to treat her wounds. Upon waking up, Rose is compelled to infect others using a bizarre new phallic growth from under her armpit. As her victims turn ravenous and begin to infect the countryside and city, Rose's boyfriend Frank is trying to desperately find her and put an end to this infection. In a variety of ways, Rabid acts as a sequel to Shivers in all but name, sharing similar themes, characters and behaviour from those infected, although, as the name would imply, the ones displayed here are far more destructive. It is important to note that Rose is played by Marilyn Chambers, a porn star at the time of the film's release who was set to play the role as Cronenberg could not secure a Sissy Spacek. This does play into the film's favour, as Marilyn does an admirable job in the film, but could also be seen as strengthening a key characteristic of her character, the method of infection. Rose has to be close to her victim in order to infect, the phallic needle penetrating the victim's body and causes him to become almost zombie-like. If examining the film from this point of view, it is very important to discuss how Rose dispatches her first victim. Upon attempting to feed on a cow, she is interrupted by a farmer who, upon seeing her, attempts to seduce and sleep with her. Rose retaliates by stabbing the farmer in the eye with her phallic stinner, attacking the very organ that will objectify and subject her to the role of a victim. Quite poignant and perhaps humorous considering she gained fame as a porn star. In a sense, fighting against the objectification of her body and carrying out her own agency. As the infection spreads and panic increases, martial law is declared within Montreal. Much like Shivers, Cronenberg is tapping into public fears of the audience, but this does contain key historical background. During the October crisis in 1970, members of the Front de Libération de Québec kidnapped Provincial Deputy Premier Pierre Laporte and British trade diplomat James Cross. As a result, the War Measures Act was used and Montreal was placed under martial law. The end result was the murder of Laporte and the kidnappers being exiled to Cuba, a time in Canadian history that the public would soon not forget. Especially not Cronenberg, whose images of a heavy military presence in Montreal assuredly conjures fear from the audience who have lived through and can personally relate to a situation as such depicted on screen. Couple historical iconography with scenes of rabid citizens attacking others in perceived safe public spaces, as well as childhood icons such as Santa Claus being murdered, and you have a horror film that is far more effective and resonant than the likes of Shivers. With a film such as this, Cronenberg was able to effectively explore themes and concerns that were laid out in Shivers but were unable to come to fruition due to time and budgetary concerns. In addition to this, Rabid managed to build Cronenberg a core audience, someone who would be dependable to provide shocks, gore, as well as societal commentary alongside this. The next project that Cronenberg would undertake would prove to be a more personal story, and that would be 1979's The Brood. The film follows Frank, who is now solely taking care of his daughter after his wife Nola has been institutionalized and refused access to their daughter. As tensions grow between the two and Nola is treated by a psychiatrist, he uses psychoplasmic therapy on her, which in a sense brings emotions and trauma into the physical. As her treatment continues, a series of bizarre murders occur throughout the town that may be linked to Nola. Helped with funding by the tax shelter years in Canada, it was one of the few films of his that featured large elements of Cronenberg's personal life which is to be found throughout the narrative. Namely the tension between Frank and Nola, as Cronenberg was going through his own nasty divorce at the time and was fighting for custody of their daughter Cassandra. As with much of his work, this narrative features a doctor who puts aside all moral and ethical guidelines in order to pursue his own controversial practice, the psychoplasmic therapy. Cronenberg's attitude to the flesh in this narrative is one of philosophical concern, examining the duality of the mind and body, particularly how the mind can alter the former. Many would put considerable distance between the mind and physical self, but Cronenberg integrates them, causing the mind and its thought process to have physical real-world consequences and creations, conjuring creatures from the unconsciousness, making the mental into physical. As Nola becomes increasingly angry and frustrated with not seeing her child, her anger manifests itself into a physical form, and as such, she gives birth to murderous mutant offspring. Although several critics at the time criticised the film for an apparent anti-feminist standpoint for casting Nola in a purely emotional and destructive position, this is not the case. If anything, Cronenberg is sympathising with Nola, showcasing how destructive emotions can have physical constructions. In addition to this, Frank is shown in a rather poor light as a passive and seemingly uninterested parent only doing the bare minimum. Another interesting aspect of these mutant manifestations is that they are in fact completely genderless, much like the anger expressed by Nola.
You didn't come here because you love me. You came here to take our daughter away and give her to somebody else. Liar. You're lying. You're lying. You're lying. I know.
It goes beyond direct anger towards Frank, but perhaps reaches beyond all moral and biological categories. It is pure, unfiltered rage, and as such, her offspring are. These creations are born without the need of a partner, making Nola self-reproducing, perhaps a being beyond the limitations of our own flesh. Another film in Cronenberg's opus that deals with the duality of the mind and body is that of Scanners, although in a far more direct and perhaps accessible way. Whilst Cronenberg was interested in how the emotional state and unconscious mind can alter the physical in The Brood, in Scanners the body is used as a conduit of sorts, a physical structure where battles of the mind are fought and suffer as a consequence. It shares various characteristics and attributes with The Brood, but whilst that was reviled for its story and some would say repulsive effects and portrayals of the human body, this was celebrated and increased Cronenberg's international stardom. In a sense, Cronenberg seems to employ particular narratives that revolve around anxieties associated with the human body in one sense or another, and Scanners is no exception. In this film, the horror is telepathy and the supposed carnage it could cause in the flesh. The narrative follows telepathic Carmen Vale, who is convinced by a security firm named Consec to hunt down and eliminate a renegade telepath, or scanner as they are known, named Revok, before he causes an uprising that may doom the human race. What this movie does explore is fear caused by that which we do not understand, panic, paranoia and anxiety surrounding the ostracized, in this case the outcasts being the Scanners. This film does capture an innate sense of public distrust and fear surrounding the Scanners, although admittedly for several good reasons, mainly pertaining to Revok and his behaviour, most notable being the famous head explosion scene. Although not all are nefarious and out to cause harm, they are still treated as anomalies, as weapons of chaos, shown by the public, which is appropriate given the time period and the rise and increasing influence of the media, which Cronenberg will explore to greater length in his later works. It is also interesting to note that the first place that we see Cameron in is a shopping centre, an almost a ritualised hub of social activity which would further emphasise the isolation he experiences due to his powers. Large groups of outcasts and feelings of isolation are a common trope in much of Cronenberg's narratives, including Seth Brundle in The Fly, the adrenaline junkies in Crash, as well as the victims of psychoplasmic therapy in his previous The Brood, who almost act as a sectarian community under Dr. Raglan's care. Much like The Brood, Cronenberg is interested on the effects the human mind can have on the physical, albeit in much more direct and visual ways. It operates differently as well, the tone being more of a conspiracy thriller rather than horror, perhaps being a primary reason why it is more accessible by mainstream audiences. What this movie acted as was a stepping stone for the director. Although he had gained fame before, this truly elevated his status as the Baron of Blood, as he was become known as. A cult director to be revered, especially thanks to the head explosion scene that is arguably the most famous effect in all of his movies. Although most would have predicted that Cronenberg would remain this bloodthirsty cult film director, Cronenberg reinvented himself continuously by adapting his themes and obsessions in intuitive and mature methods. This is especially apparent in The Fly and Dead Ringers, which will now be discussed. Although Videodrome was released prior to The Fly, it will be discussed later for thematic purposes.